Hi, everyone. My name is Joe Kelly. I'm the program coordinator with the Rochester Hills Public Library, and I'd like to welcome you all to tonight's Smart Towns program, Life History Narratives of Detroit Auto Workers in the 1950s, with Oakland University Professor of History, Daniel Clark. Our next program coming up will be on Sunday. It's a concert. It is Miller and Ford play Franck with pianist Peyton Miller and saxophonist Brant Ford. You can register for that at at calendar.rhpl.org. The program tonight will be recorded. It will be available on our website and on our YouTube page. In about 1 week from tonight, we'll have a 30-minute Q&A after the presentation here. And as I said, this is a Smart Towns program. Smart Towns is a lifelong learning program for everyone in the community, led by educational organizations in Rochester, Rochester Hills, and Oakland Township, Michigan. Smart Towns offers lectures, presentations, and courses to introduce participants to all aspects of the topic and are presented by experts in their respective fields of study, interesting topics like the wonderful history we're going to be hearing about tonight. And without further ado, I would like to, again, introduce our speaker, Daniel Clark. Daniel.
I'm not sure if I can manage to hold this and without the hand gestures I usually speak with. So I'm going to see if I can you hear me if I have it down here? Is that okay? And is that registering back there? Yikes. Okay, I can go ahead and talk. It was scaring me for a second there. Okay, yeah. Didn't want to scare all the dogs in the room either, all that stuff, high-pitched noise. But thanks for being here tonight. I know it's a strange time. I hope everyone survives, is healthy, and we all can get back to normal in the near future. But I want to thank the Rochester Hills Public Library for inviting me again. If I put it further away, is that better? I don't know. Okay. Usually that happens if it's right next to you, so I don't know quite what to do. But Joe has disappeared temporarily. Maybe he'll come back and save us. I did speak here in this room, would have been March 2019, about a year before the pandemic hit. And I was talking on a similar topic. I don't know if any of you were here, maybe not. If you were here, you came back again, and I don't know what that says about you or about me. But anyways, in 2019, I recently had a book published called "Disruption in Detroit: Auto Workers and the Elusive Postwar Boom." I'm not shilling the book tonight, but I'm pointing out that that book wasn't the one I expected to write based on the research I was doing. Okay. Disruption started out as an oral history project. I was trying to locate retired auto workers who had been active in the 1950s, maybe back into World War II in that era. When I started the project in the early 2000s, that was about as far back as I could go and still locate a sizable number of people to talk to. And I wanted to learn more about their lives. The focus on the 1950s, that was the supposed heyday of the United Auto Workers Union with lucrative contracts and benefits and all. And I thought that those oral histories would be the core of the book I was writing. I thought that I would have a lot of interesting stories about people, and I would be able to present that. I thought it would add something new to the historical literature about the auto industry and auto work and UAW, perhaps. But if you ask any historian, you'll find that no research project proceeds according to plan. Things come up. Sometimes it's negative stuff. You have kids, things get derailed. That's not negative. I'm just talking about for the point of the book. Don't get me wrong there. But I spent a few years staying home with kids, kid with special needs, and the research had to be put on hold for a while. But anyways, that happened to me as well. While listening to and transcribing the first 25 or so of the interviews, I was curious why so many of the people, white workers as well as black workers, recalled the years after World War II as economically unstable and insecure, because that ran really counter to what the literature said about the period. So I kind of put my original vision on hold for a bit and decided I needed to check out and see if these people were, I guess, having representative experiences for auto workers in that period, or if they were the outliers, and I just managed to locate them. So that led to years of newspaper research on microfilm, and I found that the stories were corroborated by other forms of evidence that it was a period of insecurity and instability. And so in that book, let's say that the newspaper evidence kind of overwhelmed the oral history evidence. The oral history evidence still appears, but it's kind of little snippets used to make a point, little pieces of people's lives extracted and put in the argument the way that historians do, to try to prove their point. So, readers of that book, Disruption, won't learn much about who the interviewees were, where they came from, what they wanted from their lives, what struggles they faced, and how they coped. And it always nagged at me that I didn't feel I had done justice to the people I'd interviewed. It wasn't like I owed them anything necessarily, but I thought I did, just based on what they had given me, the gifts of their interviews. So I'm nearing completion of a companion book now. It's not yet titled, but it does return to that original vision. And I just wanted to talk with you a little bit tonight more about how it came to be, a little bit about what I found, and as long as I don't drag on too long, I'll even maybe play a little bit of an interview, a recording, just so you can hear a little bit about what at least one or two of the people sound like. So this new book, will be comprised of these life history narratives drawn from the oral history interviews, and I've been working on that, and that's part of what I want to talk about today, how that process unfolds. And really, I was just trying to figure out how ordinary workers felt and lived, and ordinary workers aren't ordinary in any meaningful sense of the word. By that, I'd really mean that they wouldn't normally appear in the historical record. Because no one's ordinary to their own families, the people who love them, the people they work with. But the term or the designation I was trying to make was that I wanted to dig beneath the surface of high-level officials in the UAW and stuff like that who definitely get more attention. So some of the significance of what I've discovered with the oral history interviews is significant only because of the limitations of the historical scholarship that's out there. When I started the project about 20 years ago, hardly anything had been written about auto workers themselves. There was a lot about Walter Reuther, the longtime president of the United Auto Workers, and you could learn a lot about UAW politics, their policies. A large part of that is because UAW donates their voluminous records. They aptly named Walter Reuther Archives of Labor and Urban Affairs at Wayne State University. And so you can go there and find hundreds and hundreds of boxes of documents and do that kind of research, and it's very valuable. But you won't find much there about the lives of ordinary auto workers, except for the interview recordings I donated, okay? But anyways, I don't pretend in the book or tonight to give you anything like a full picture of the lives of Detroit auto workers in the 50s. I interviewed about 45 former auto workers. That's out of the several 100,000, give or take a few 100,000, people who actually worked in auto plants in the post-World War II years through around 1960. But knowing something is better than knowing nothing. And one of my points is that if the lives of a few dozen people complicate the narrative, kind of really disrupt and overturn the narrative of what we thought we knew about auto workers, think what we would have if we multiplied those 40 interviews by enough to get us into the 1,000 interview, 2,000 interview range. I think it would be really rich and exciting. Also impossible to do right now. The time has passed. So at the risk of oversimplification, what I faced when I started the research in terms of the historical wisdom that was out there is that auto workers, at least white ones, experience stable working conditions, steadily rising wages, new benefits like health insurance and pensions, and that really this notion became even stronger in the couple of years before Disruption in Detroit was published, as people, I think, yearn for some kind of golden age as opposed to the inequality and labor issues that we see today. Some scholars were calling the 1950s the golden age for all workers, but led by auto workers and steel workers in that period. And along the same lines, it was argued that any, especially man, could show up at a factory gate and get hired in and be guaranteed a lifetime of secure employment. Spoiler alert, I didn't find anyone who fit that description, but nonetheless, that was out there, and I'm sure there's someone who fits that description. The existing historical framework emphasized that this generation of auto workers in the 1950s was different from the generation in the 1930s. There had been a lot of turnover, a lot of new workers coming in World War II, a whole lot in 1950 and 53. And those workers weren't familiar with the sit-down strikes in the 1930s or what had prompted the organization of the UAW in the first place. And that got translated by historians into apathy about the union. I argued something different, but that's what was out there in the literature. And there's a great historian at Michigan State named Lisa Fine who argued that most auto workers were more interested in deer hunting than union politics in the 1950s. And she looked into that, and it's a pretty fascinating argument. So, scholars have recognized that things were definitely different for African Americans who were discriminated against in terms of access to jobs, who lost their jobs disproportionately because of the decentralization of the auto industry away from Detroit and because of automation, eliminating a lot of jobs that they were confined to. Women also didn't fit into this framework. So many had lost their jobs after World War II and also faced limited job opportunities in the auto industry and sexual harassment on the job. There's some really good scholarship on those fronts, but most of that scholarship is based on grievances that were filed by African American workers and women workers, and then they showed up in the UAW records and were available to look at through the archives. Good scholarship to look at those. But what I'm getting at is it's really hard to know anything more about the people who filed those grievances than what you can gain from those individual moments in their lives. Does that make sense? Just again, hard to figure out who they were, where they came from, all that. But really good scholarship. A lot of the literature just considers ordinary auto workers in terms of their relationship to UAW policies and Walter Reuther's policies. Were they for Walter Reuther's policies, or did they want to go in a different direction? And that reflects some of the limited vision of scholars, but it also shows how difficult it is to actually get to what these ordinary workers were involved in. They kind of are just used to project ideas upon, for the most part, in the scholarship. So that's why I thought there was an opening for what I was doing. My project began long ago. I said the summer of 2000. I began conducting interviews. I mentioned that there were potentially thousands of people, maybe tens of thousands even at that point, who could be interview candidates. But it was a little bit tricky to try to locate them. How to find these people? How do you find people to interview? There were a lot in Metro Detroit, a whole lot in Arizona, a whole lot in Florida. But this is a time with no social media, no real ability to put out that kind of a call. And so what I did is I relied on a running buddy of mine who was an engineer at what was then a Ford plant in Ypsilanti. And he got me in touch with a retiree chapter president there. And a student of mine at Oakland University, Steve Clinton, got me in touch with the retiree chapter president at local 653 at Pontiac Motor. And I would go to the retiree luncheons, and I would be given a little chance to make a pitch, go table to table, and I would try to recruit people. And I had to make it fast because by the time bingo and raffles started, there's no way anyone's listening to me. Okay, but anyways, I found that a lot of people thought, even though they were retired auto workers, they thought that the history of auto workers was the history of Walter Reuther. And so many people said to me, I don't know much about Walter Reuther. I can't help you. And I would say, well, I don't want to know about Walter Reuther. I want to know about you. But retirees are busy, probably busier sometimes than they were when they were working. And so it took a while, but I managed to get a lot of people, signed up to interview. Doesn't seem like much now, but at the time it did. And it takes forever to transcribe interviews too. So it ended up being quite a bit of work. Let's see. I just want to pause for a second and just offer thanks to all the people who did help me along the way, and especially the people who shared their lives with me. And it's a gift that can't be quantified. It's nothing anyone had to do. And I do have deep regrets that I took that detour and produced a different book, because now so many people I interviewed are no longer with us. They passed and won't be able to see what I've done. But I've tried to make available the transcripts and recordings to them along the way, and I hope that I can connect with some of their children as well, or other family members, and they can see. I've sent a few of the life history narratives that I've drafted out to families as well, just in case that there's something they're interested in. So anyways, most of the people I interviewed were young, in the 50s, because I interviewed them in the 2000s. So most were born in the 1920s or early 1930s. A few were a bit younger, a bit older. most of them were part of the big hiring waves in 1950 or 1953, but a few had started during World War II. Many of the people came from outside the state of Michigan: North Dakota, Minnesota, Illinois, Missouri, Arkansas, Alabama, Kentucky, West Virginia, North Carolina. Some from Michigan's Upper Peninsula, some from the upper lower peninsula. Or I'm trying to say, Michigan. But I also interviewed a number of second-generation immigrants from Poland, from Greece, their families coming from those places, from Turkey. The majority of the people I interviewed were white men, who were also the majority of the auto workforce in that period. Quite a few white women also volunteered to be interviewed, disproportionate to the number of white women in the workforce, but they tended to outlive the men and loved to be at those retiree luncheons, and so happy to add more of their perspectives to the mix. I had 3 interviews with African American men, although one by heritage was as much African Canadian as African American. No African American women, but hardly any African American women were hired in auto plants in the 50s. So that actually reflects the gender discrimination, race and gender discrimination of the period. So when I began doing the interviews, I had no idea what I would discover. Based on the brief sketch of the literature that I laid out for you, I surely expected to hear stories of prosperity, how they spent their money, what kind of homes they had, cars and vacations, and new opportunities for the children. But I wanted to be open to whatever people told me and to avoid assumptions that auto workers should have thought or behaved in certain ways. The scholarship seemed filled with that sort of stuff. Part of a historian's task is to examine people on their own terms, and so I was really determined to focus on what they found meaningful in their lives. I didn't want to measure anyone against anyone's standards of social justice or any kind of set of principles that might have existed at the time, union, radical, conservative, anything else. I didn't assume that there were any particular ideas that anyone should have or any particular path they should have taken. So I developed this massive 6-page single-spaced list of questions that I wanted to ask, okay? Because, I'm going to be well prepared. And it turned out to be a good exercise for thinking about the categories of topics I wanted to explore, but I don't think I ever asked any of those questions consecutively, because that's a bad way to do oral history. The conversations, the interviews work best if the questions are generated more organically from the discussion. You listen for cues and clues in sometimes cryptic comments, unexpected answers that people give you, and you follow up if you're alert, okay? My first questions were about when and where interviewees were born, followed in a lot of cases by discussions of childhood. I thought it was a good way to develop rapport, in part because people expected me to ask about Walter Reuther, and in part because they were the only people in the room who could answer those questions. I realized after a few that some people expected the interviews to be more like a quiz, that they might fail, and that was impossible. I mean, it's not at all what I came into the interview thinking about, but it did cause some anxiety. So those kinds of questions about their own childhoods, about their lives, broke ice, and also gave a lot of really important insights about the trajectories of their lives. For example, the lifelong impact on a child of particularly loving or distant parents, things that you'll never find in the labor history literature, but really have an impact on people's lives. The tragic loss of a family member, a parent, a sibling, chopping cotton in Arkansas, negotiating the dangers of Jim Crow, Alabama. One person grew up in a ramshackle house that sat in a creek in West Virginia in the mountains. It was the cheapest housing in town. And it had a big impact on him throughout his life. I talked to people who survived the Great Depression by illegally hawking homemade alcohol in Missouri, or newspapers on the streets of Ypsilanti. And it's hard for me to believe that those experiences didn't play some kind of role in how these people behaved and what they thought about as adults. I can't know for sure, but I think we all know that we do reflect on our childhoods and things that had a big imprint on us. So while the book that I finished a few years ago places bits and pieces of auto workers' oral histories into the larger context of auto work and the auto industry, the approach I've gone back to now situates people's auto jobs in the larger context of their lives. And it just looks a whole lot different that way. So it's not a traditional academic monograph. I do have an argument, and that's that ordinary auto workers in the early post-war years were complex, multidimensional people with aspirations and concerns of all sorts. Kind of wishy-washy, but it's you find all kinds of answers if you scratch the surface. Their lives are much richer, more interesting, and at times more confounding than we can tell from the existing literature. As for the hundreds of thousands of auto workers I didn't interview, I didn't get to, that's a mystery. Most likely only their friends and family members will ever know about their lives, and that information, that knowledge, that memory disappears, often within a generation if no one records it, if there are no records kept. As I said before, it might have been possible to learn more about more workers if there had been a concerted effort. If I had worked harder to locate more interviewees and not taken that turn in my research, but even if I had done nothing but interview people for several years, I still would have only talked to a small fraction of the auto workers who were out there. With any oral history project, incompleteness extends beyond the size of the interview sampling. I'm talking a bit about the methodology here, and I hope you'll bear with me. Anyone who listens to recordings or reads transcripts from any project, and certainly from mine, will experience some frustration that certain questions did not get asked, or certain questions weren't answered. During an interview, it's difficult to anticipate what other people, either the next day or 20 years down the line, will wish that you had asked, will wish that you had covered. And it's hard enough to stay in the present in an interview and just listen really carefully to what you're hearing and to respond appropriately. You're always trying to assess whether or not you know better which direction the interview should take, or if you need to be following the inputs that you're getting. When I listen to recordings of the interviews I've conducted, sometimes I'm impressed with how I handle those situations, and sometimes I'm embarrassed at the things that I missed, at the things that I didn't get, didn't understand at the time. A momentary lapse in attention, fatigue, or just plain cluelessness, can derail a promising line of conversation. Doesn't necessarily derail the interview, but you see, wow, that would have been a good thing to follow up on. Too late now. And unfortunately, it's hard to know anything concrete about what didn't get discussed, right? Historians aren't novelists. We don't get to make things up. We have to have some kind of evidence for the claims we make. And moreover, the interviewer-interviewee relationship and the personalities of both, they really have a lot to do with what you learn and what you don't learn in an interview. To what extent are people's recollections or what they were willing to share with me influenced by who I was, how I behaved, and the types of questions I asked? Some people had an abundance of energy and were still going strong at 3 hours, and I'm bobbing and weaving and hardly able to function. And some people were done in an hour. Some transcripts are just words on a page, just words, because the answers were so loquacious. And sometimes there's a lot of white space on the page because people give really terse answers, and you don't know if that's the way they speak or if that's how they were responding to me. Always difficult to know those things. And given those limitations, I'm just admitting that it might be overly reckless for me to even try to create someone's life history narrative based on an hour or 2 or 3 out of their lives at one moment, at a certain point in their lives. And so you have to ask yourself, what authority do I have to write anything at all about someone's life? But in my experience, during most interviews, you reach a point where you feel like you've gotten to the essence of who somebody is, at least at that moment in their lives. And I don't know how to describe it, but it's like there's an emotional tone or some kind of vibe where you feel like you've gotten it. You have some sense of what really they're about. And you know that you haven't touched on everything that's important to that person. You certainly haven't talked about everything that's unimportant to that person, or you can only scratch the surface of what they've done in their lives. That might be the best that we can get for most people, especially if they don't leave diaries, don't leave letters, don't leave other ways of getting at their own histories. But oral historians have come to recognize that all we can learn really is how people make sense of their lives at the time of the interview, when we conducted the interview. People might have interpreted the events in their lives differently 20 years earlier, 10 years later. We're always evaluating and reevaluating what we did in our lives. Memory is imperfect under the best of circumstances, but oral historians no longer think that we have a perfect window into the past by talking to people. We know it's filtered. We know it's constantly in revision in people's minds. But they do tell us how people made sense of their lives at that point in time, and I think that's really worth something. It's also worth noting that no branch of history, not just oral history, no branch of history has the kind of sources that are perfect, reliable windows into the past. It's not something that's peculiar to oral history methodology. But it's possible that people misled me, or certainly some people misremembered or didn't know dates when World War II ended, this or that or the other, and that didn't bother me whatsoever. I could go back and do some spot checking and try to figure out as best I could when things happen. And sometimes that matters a lot when things happen. Women tended to remember things by when their children were born, men by the cars they bought or something like that, And the events that I studied for disruption in Detroit helped me place some things chronologically. And a lot of times I had to make my best sense. I had to infer as best I could. And I tried to be clear when I was making logical leaps with my language, and when I thought I could be pretty specific. Sometimes people remember things that are just seared into their minds. Again, it could be when a child is born, when a draft notice arrived, your first day getting a job at Pontiac Motor. Some people had that just, like lasered into their memories. But a lot of other things are fuzzy, and there could be misrepresentations. There wasn't any incentive for anyone to mislead me. There wasn't any monetary gain for anybody, anything like that. And the candor with which people discussed having children out of wedlock, infidelity, divorce, domestic violence, poverty, things that would have provoked some shame at their time, made me think that there's a tendency not to shy away from hard truths. In fact, a lot of people said, well, I came here, I'm just going to tell you like it is, or like it was. And that's, again, a gift that can't be measured. So anyways, all we're going to do now is just switch gears. I'm going to give you a few brief sketches of some of the people I interviewed, just a handful, maybe 2 or 3, just to give you a sense of what's in there. The narratives themselves are much longer, more involved. And the little snapshots I'm going to give you right now probably focus more on work than some of the narratives will in the new book. But after that, what I'm going to do is test out something with you, test your patience a little bit, and try to get you to see how you can also aggregate from the 20 or so narratives that will be in the book and see some patterns that explore some of the issues that go way beyond work. So, just hang in there. We'll see how it works. Anyways, and maybe I'll play a little bit of audio. Maybe that'll be in the Q&A too. Who knows? The first person I thought I'd just talk a little bit about was named Gene Johnson. And he's one of those guys who said, I wasn't going to show up. I wasn't going to show up. He was, for one thing, afraid that I would discover that his first child was born before he was married. But he said, nope, that's life. I'm here to tell it like it was. But he was the guy who sold the homebrew down in southeastern Missouri during the Great Depression. He started the interview by telling amazing stories about how his family had to survive, and it involved bootlegging. He also got a little older, worked on Works Progress Administration jobs, federal government New Deal programs in the 1930s. He sawed wood, worked on section gangs. He also loved playing bluegrass in bars. He had a family band. His dad was quite a musician, and all the little kids would be up there and play in the honky-tonks and make a bit of money that way as well. He started doing that when he was 8 years old. Music was always his passion. He worked in cotton fields too. And, I think I'll bring it up again, but he said that no job in any auto plant was as hard as working in a cotton field. The snakes, the heat. And he said, well, the worst thing was that you got thirsty, and they would bring big jugs of water out there to the field, okay? But the older guys got the first dibs on the water, and they were chewing tobacco all day. And so by the time that jug got to you, it's like half tobacco juice, half water. Yeah, there you go. Okay, that became a frame of reference for him, throughout his life, right? He came to Pontiac, Michigan during World War II and got a job at Pontiac Motor, but he was drafted in 1944. When he was in training, basic training, he got in a vehicle accident out in Washington State, and he spent 14 months recovering. The war was over by the time he was physically able to serve again. He re-enlisted, he enlisted because he had been drafted in 1946 when he got out of the hospital, and he lost his department seniority at Pontiac Motor. If he had been drafted, he would have retained his seniority. But one thing I learned is that a lot of people, had their auto careers disrupted by military service. They're either because they were drafted or because of enlistment. Very common. He spent 4 years on administrative duty at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, he was amazed that he got chosen for that because he had a pretty bad academic record. Okay, and it wasn't his fault. He had to work on a cotton field throughout the school year and miss 3 or 4 months of school every year. That was common for white children who had to pick cotton, and obviously African American kids who had to pick cotton as well. So it turns out he was married. He already had children. He thought the military could be a career, and he was also trying to race his brother to see who could get promoted to the highest rank. Okay, that was what was motivating him, not what Walter Reuther was doing or anything like that. He would have re-enlisted in 1952, but he and his wife did have 4 children, and the youngest had a serious illness that meant that he couldn't walk. And Gene was worried that if he ended up having to serve in Korea, then his wife would be home with 4 kids, one who had to be lifted everywhere that he went. That had a big impact on his future. But when he left the military, they didn't necessarily go straight back to Detroit or Pontiac and resume auto work. He took his 52 weeks of $20 a week benefit from the military, and they went back to Missouri, where they were from. Gene tried to be a farmer, first with a milk cow and then with chickens, but he bought a milk cow that couldn't be milked, okay? And he built chicken coops, but the hens didn't lay their eggs in the coops. They laid their eggs out in the woods. And he didn't know any better. It was discovered weeks later, and he was the laughingstock of the community. All right? It was kind of weird because he came from this just tiny, town, might be too strong of a term, in southeast Missouri, but his wife lived in an even smaller town. And so they called him a city slicker. He didn't know how to farm, okay? And it just didn't seem fair, to him, since he had spent his whole life chopping cotton. But he also had a spiritual conversion while in Missouri, when, according to his account, a group of Pentecostal faith healers cured his son's disease. From then, he devoted his life to God, and the only drawback, he said, was that he could no longer play bluegrass music in smoky bars. He had to play church music in the church orchestra. He and his family moved back to Pontiac, but no one was hiring, so he drove a cab for 7 or 8 months. Made a lot less money than he did as an auto worker. Hired back in at Pontiac Motor in 1953, one of those big surges. He worked a few weeks until there was an explosion at a Livonia transmission plant that shut down all GM plants around the region and a whole lot of other auto plants as well. It was an event that wreaked havoc on Detroit auto workers and the auto industry. So he went back to driving a cab. He was rehired eventually in press metal, heavy presses, fenders, bumpers. The machines were so loud, he lost his hearing. He saw lots of people lose their arms, their hands, their fingers because of either inappropriate safety equipment or inappropriate use of existing safety equipment. Even in years of maximum overtime, Gene just never worked on a Sunday. He almost lost his job because he wouldn't come in on a Sunday to work. His faith was so strong. And there's a whole lot more I could say, but I want to get a couple more in here too, okay? Just an amazing person to interview. I want to talk a little bit about Margaret Beaudry. She was born in 1925 in the UP in Chatham, Michigan, which is kind of near Marquette, Munising, that area. Her dad was a truck driver and was gone most of the time. Her mom raised 12 kids. Margaret was number 6. They didn't have much money at all. Margaret wanted to be a Broadway singer. She loved to sing, loved to dance. In fact, when I met her, she was running the karaoke machine at a picnic. Okay, I don't do karaoke. Margaret left home for Pontiac when she was 16. She followed a few of her older siblings down, and she got a job at Scribbs Drive-In. And she stayed there for the summer, but she went back, thought she should finish high school. She was frustrated about being back in the UP, and she returned to Pontiac after school ended, and she worked at Neisner's department store. And Neisner became a fallback job for her throughout her working career. She got married during World War II, and when her husband was stationed in Dodge City, Kansas, she took a Greyhound bus to join him. She found a job at a Woolworths down in Dodge City, but she moved back to Pontiac when her husband was shipped overseas to fight. And in Pontiac, she went to work both at Neisner's, and then she lied about her age and got a job at for GM on the truck line at first, and then she produced those ducks, the amphibious vehicles that could be used in combat. She also worked nights at a hamburger joint that was called the Triple X. So Neisner's, like I said, and Triple X became her safety net whenever she was laid off. One story that really stood out was that Margaret was put on water pump preparation. The water pumps were built, but they were going to be sent over to Europe to be put in vehicles, military vehicles there. And her job was to pound corks into the holes in a water pump to make sure nothing got in them when they were shipped overseas. She had no idea what a water pump was for, how it worked, and occasionally she'd pound a cork into a hole and the cork would go right through. And she just put another cork over the top and carried on. Well, at some point, months later, she got a visit from the FBI at the factory, and they were accusing her of sabotaging the war effort because those floating corks inside the water pump were clogging and causing overheating of vehicles in Europe. She was mortified. But she was also very angry that they would accuse her of lack of loyalty, and she told her that her husband was in the military, all of her brothers were fighting overseas. How dare you? She was 5 feet tall, maybe 90 pounds, and she had a temper, and she stood her ground, and she demanded respect. And even the FBI agents kind of, whoa, okay, we know now that you were not a German saboteur. There are a lot of other stories that showed her, let's say, her standing up for herself in these periods. She knew she was likely to lose her job at the end of the war. She said she didn't mind. She went out to Spokane, Washington to be with her husband when he came back from the Pacific Theater. She got a job there separating yolks from whites at a local egg factory. And after her husband was discharged, they went back to the UP. He was a house painter, and they wanted to make a go of it. She gave birth to their first child shortly afterwards, and she stayed home to be a mom. But she emphasized that she never really was keen on domestic life. She really wanted to work outside the home. Times got tough in the painting business in the National Recession in 1949. Margaret encouraged her husband to head back to Pontiac, which they eventually did. And as soon as her daughter was in school, Margaret went back to work at Eisner's. Her husband didn't want her to work outside the house at all, but she wanted to work back at an auto plant because she knew the money was better. She, in fact, maybe, I think I have audio queued up, maybe we'll listen to it at some point, but she said that she told a white lie. She didn't tell her that she was going to work in an auto plant. And if she did, they would just have a little bit more money, to spend. But there was a time later in the 50s when she got rehired and didn't tell him. Okay, just let it play out. Anyways, she experienced all kinds of layoffs in the 50s. Had to transfer to a lot of different jobs because of a lack of seniority. One time when she was called back, she realized that some men with less seniority than she had gotten called back before her, a violation of the union contract. And she filed a grievance, and she fought, and she knew that maybe there was someone else besides her who was deserving of whatever back pay could be gleaned, because she didn't know if she was the one who had the most seniority. So she went around in her department and tried to get people to join her and find out who deserved the money, and no one else wanted to get involved. And she was very despondent about that. She ended up getting all the money, but she thought that women should be standing up for themselves and asserting their rights. Anyways, I could keep going along those lines, but I just wanted to emphasize again that if she had her way, she would have been able to somehow cultivate her interest in singing and dancing. She would have had some outlet for that beyond the karaoke machine at the summer picnics, she was one of those who was still going strong at 3.5 hours, and had more energy than I have ever had in my life. One more quick sketch here, if I can do it quickly. L.J. Scott, who was an African-American man, he was born in 1931 in Linwood, Alabama. He was the 14th of 14 kids. His family worked as sharecroppers, and they moved frequently trying to get a better deal on rent arrangements for the land they worked. LJ, as he put it, got in trouble a lot because he got too biggity with landowners like Mr. Horace. He spoke up. One of his offenses was that he was good at math and he kept a ledger on all of the transactions. Mr. Horace would lend them or furnish them with food, tools, this sort of thing, and keep the books. And at the end of the year, you try to settle up with the cotton crop. But LJ kept his own ledger, and at the end of the year, he challenged some of Mr. Horace's calculations, which could be a death sentence for an African-American kid, anyone at that point in time. LJ raised his niece, who was 1.5 years old when her mother, LJ's sister, died, and LJ was just 10 at the time. But he looked after her his entire life, and always sent her money, and always wanted to be living in the same town where she lived, looking after her. Farming proved difficult when LJ's father died of cancer in 1949. 3 years before then, when LJ was 15, he really had to run the farm, completely on his own. But when his father finally died, he followed his brothers to Florida to pick fruit, grapefruit, oranges. And it wasn't an immediate trip to Detroit. They went down there. It was difficult for LJ to keep up. He was small for his age, but his brothers padded his totals. They gave him some of their picking so that he could stay employed. In the off season, he bussed dishes at a hotel. He was a groundskeeper at a nursing home, and he worked in a bakery. Again, not the kind of show up at a factory gate, get a lifetime of secure employment story. All these stories are circuitous. LJ always wanted to be a doctor, ever since a physician helped him overcome his asthma problems when he was young. But he said it wasn't in the cards. Part of that was because he wasn't able to take the classes that would allow him to go to medical school. He wasn't able to do that, and that prevented him from doing other things as well later in life. He hired in, when he moved to Michigan in 1951, he brought his mother there, he brought Louise, his niece, there, and he hired in at Chevrolet within a week. But he was suspended after a day and a half because he was smoking in a no-smoking area in the plant. He didn't know it was a no-smoking area, and he was let go. He stopped by a Chrysler plant during his suspension and got hired on the spot. He was actually trying to get hired at Plymouth, but he showed up at the wrong factory and got a job, okay? But after 84 days, 6 days before his probationary period was up, he was let go. That was very common at that time. You know, if companies weren't sure they needed that many workers, they would lay them off before they got seniority. Okay? LJ was desperate for work. He put an ad in both the Free Press and the Detroit News seeking a job, and he got a job offer. I couldn't believe it. You know, I thought that was kind of crazy, given how many people were looking for work at the time. But he got an offer for a job at a steel mill, but he had a brother in Pontiac who had 4 kids. LJ was single at the time, and he gave the job to his brother because his brother's needs were greater. LJ got a job at an Army surplus store for about a year, packing orders for shipment. Once again, he got in trouble because of his ledger. He realized that the owner was shooting them an hour and not paying them what they were owed. And he confronted the owner with that, and he got fired. So anyways, eventually he got a job at Pontiac Motor in 1952. Things were looking up. And then within a week, he got his draft notice. Okay. He served at Camp Gordon in Georgia. He was assigned to be a cook. That didn't bother him at first because he said he played dumb because he didn't want to be in the military at all. He was working in the kitchen in Camp Gordon when he became friends at first with a white officer from Plymouth, Michigan. But LJ refused to give the officer special meal privileges because he thought he could get in trouble and lose his job, and get disciplined. And after that, the officer from Plymouth started to assign him demeaning duties and physically demanding ones, and it really infuriated LJ. So after he was discharged, LJ bought a handgun and spent the next month driving around Metro Detroit looking for this white officer from Plymouth, Michigan. He eventually calmed down, realized he would have ruined his life, but it was harrowing to hear the stories of what he would do trying to find this person because he had talked. He knew where this guy hung out. And he was that outraged. But he calmed down, went back to work at Pontiac Motor, and remembered 1955 as a boom year, bought his first new car, and then he remembered the next couple of years as being really terrible because so many cars had been produced in 55 that not enough customers were there to buy cars the next couple of years. So what he did, he decided to go and become a barber. He went to barber school, and for the next 9 years, he worked at Pontiac Motor whenever jobs were available, and he ran a barber shop to make sure that he had some way of making money. So interesting stuff like that. I'm still kind of in range here for time. I could do more of those. It's just a little flavor of the kinds of stories, but I think you can see how if auto work is just embedded into the lives of people, things look a lot different than if we just talk about auto workers as one big mass of people that had some kind of inherent sameness or some kind of categories that made sense. But what I want to do right now, I'm going to test your patience maybe a little bit. I hope not, but the ones that I just offered you, the trajectories, focused not just on work, but work was kind of central to how I framed them. But what I wanted to do is give you a sense of some of the other themes that I've been developing in these narratives. Again, by aggregating, kind of throughout the interview. So I'm going to refer to some people I haven't mentioned. There's no quiz on the names or their experiences, but I think you'll get the point. And I'll do a few of these. I'll see if your eyes are glazed over or if I'm connecting in any way. But you'll hear some repeats too, because Margaret Beaudry and L.J. Scott and Gene Johnson will appear, in some of these descriptions as well. But one of the things that I did is I really tried to think hard about all the people who had some kind of hardship in their early lives, some kind of trauma that they dealt with. And again, not being able to draw any particular linear conclusion from those events, but maybe it's because my mother died in childbirth when I was 7, and so maybe I was clued to those things when I heard people talk about them. But I did mention that Margaret Beaudry had a loving mother, rarely saw her father, but she had this positive energy that was infectious. Her sense of self and self-worth couldn't be shaken. There was something in her background that gave her that kind of solidity, that rock. On the other hand, Paul Ross never met his father, and his mother seemed burdened by his presence. Spent a little bit of time with him, but sent him to her grandmother's to be raised with 12 or 13 other relatives that he didn't really know all that well. And that bothered him throughout his life. We don't know what Paul's mother thought about her situation, but it could not have been easy to be a single mother in the 1930s in North Carolina. And again, I just want to emphasize that I'm not making any determinative claims about this, but there's something similar in almost everyone's background, or something profound. Elwyn Brown's parents separated when he was a child. He lived with an aunt and uncle for several years. Emerald Neal's parents divorced when he was young, and he lived with an aunt from that point on. Never saw his parents. After his parents died when he was about 7, Lucky Coleman was raised mainly by older siblings and many kind people who looked after him while he sold newspapers. He was the one who was hawking newspapers on the streets in Ypsilanti. Joe Woods' mother was chronically ill throughout his childhood. Ernie Lyles' father died in a Mississippi River flood in Arkansas, in the backwaters of the streams that flooded in there. Paul Ish's older brother died from drinking turpentine, and his parents never recovered from the loss. 4 of Edith Arnold's 11 siblings died either in childbirth or infancy, and her mother seemed distant and short-tempered. Perhaps from these ordeals. 5 of Don Hester's 13 siblings died in infancy or childhood. His parents separated when he was young, and his mother died when he was 11. And he was one who tended to act out, throughout his life. Who knows? It wasn't preordained, wasn't determined, but when you look at the trajectory of his life and what he experienced, it makes some sense. Don and his younger brothers entered the foster care system, and he looked after them. He would hitchhike like 20 miles out to where his younger brothers are staying at a foster home and bring them treats, candy every weekend. They also had been shipped out to foster homes in the Thumb area and had been kicked out of them. One when people just got tired of them, and the other time when they messed with farm machinery and broke a piece of equipment and had to be sent back to Pontiac. Let's see. Katie Newman's parents separated when she was a teenager, and Dorothy Sackle lost 2 younger siblings, her mother and her father, during her late adolescence and early adulthood. And one of the Smart Town themes, I think, right now is resiliency, right? And that's one thing I'm trying to tap into here to show you that these people were experiencing resilient from early. You can see some of that in how they don't know what's going on. Is there something I should be doing?
No, I'm not sure. I think.
Could be me. The radio in my car blitzed out this week, so I might be having an impact on technology. Who knows? But anyways, those are, that's one of the themes that I've been developing, just trying to show that, life was much more complicated than following Walter Reuther's ideas. Getting a job in an auto plant, during and after World War II did not require a high school degree, and relatively few of the people I talked to actually graduated from high school. But education was important enough that many of them walked many miles each way to get to school. Sometimes got a ride, sometimes got a sleigh ride in the winter if someone would pick them up. Albert Amshay, Margaret Beaudry, Elwyn Brown, Paul Ish, Dorothy Sackle, they all completed high school. But Paul's graduation was delayed 1.5 years because he had a habit of running away to a ranch in Nebraska with some of his friends and disappearing, and his parents would get very upset with him. Dorothy Sackle hoped that her high school degree would allow her to become a secretary, not an auto worker, and she finally did become a secretary when she was 50 years old. But tight family budgets or lack of a high school in the area prevented some people from completing their schooling. Bud Weber attended a Catholic school through 8th grade, but there wasn't any high school in northern Michigan where he was. It was a little south of Traverse City. Edith Arnold's parents couldn't afford to keep her in school and arranged for her to become a nanny, and that's a job that she despised. She deeply regretted not being able to finish school, but she didn't have fond memories of being whacked on her left hand for using her left hand in school. You had to be right-handed in school when she was a kid. Katie Newman dropped out of school because her family couldn't afford to keep their car during the Depression, and there were no school buses where they eventually moved. Tom Agorgianitis, Don Hester, and Paul Ross dropped out, either to make money or out of a lack of interest, or both. Paul remembered acting out a lot in school, which would make sense given the disruptions in his childhood. Don had fond memories only of the playground. Remember playing soccer, getting kicked in the shins, but that was it. James McGuire excelled at math, and in his estimation was way down below everybody else and everything else. But school was an afterthought, given the contributions he was supposed to make to his family in that West Virginia village with the stream and the house in the middle of it. But later, he did vocational training programs in refrigeration, air conditioning, appliance repair, surveying. He was a genius at these sorts of things. And you always wonder what could have happened if he'd had a chance to develop those skills. Not that that's the be-all and end-all, but that wasn't in the works, it wasn't on the horizon. James Franklin was an African-American worker who made good money at age 17 by dropping out of high school and taking a job at the Willow Run bomber plant. He wanted to go back and finish his degree, but he was also struck by the fact that his high school math teacher was right next to him on the line, had dropped out of school as well because the money was so much better. Those who grew up in the cotton fields, I mentioned before, generally missed 3 or 4 months of school every year. L.J. Scott from Alabama is African-American. He regretted having to leave school just as the classes got interesting every year. He'd have to go and hoe cotton, pick cotton. I mentioned that he couldn't become a doctor, which was his dream job, but at one point he wanted to become licensed to run a TV repair shop, but he had to take trigonometry, he had to take some other math classes, and those weren't available to him when he was growing up. But, as I mentioned, even white boys like Gene Johnson, he had to miss a lot of school. Joe Woods, the local segregated school for African Americans where he lived in Alabama only went through 6th grade. That's all he could do. He went and lived with relatives in Tuscaloosa for a while, but then he had to go back and help with the farm. So what I'm getting at here is that school was a luxury that a lot of these families just simply couldn't afford. It would have been interesting to see what if Margaret Beaudry could have pursued her interests, James McGuire been able to follow his interest in math. But for most of these people, skilled trades was really the pinnacle of their aspirations. Those were off limits to African Americans and to women in the period. It had nothing to do with your education, nothing to do with your training. Let's see. That's some about early jobs. I'm going to try to. I'm going to switch to religion and church, skipping over one. I've got just a few minutes. I know that's fast, so I've got like about 2 or 3 more minutes than that clock says I do. But labor historians are really bad at trying to work on religion, incorporate religion into their analyses. There's more now, but for the most part, religion factors into labor history accounts in terms of whether or not it helped or hindered organization campaigns or strikes, that sort of thing. But only recently have people tried to figure out how religion impacted people's lives, and it's hard to do that with ordinary people. And I don't have the ability to take my analysis here all that far, but I just wanted to point out what I could glean from these interviews. Paul Ish grew up as part of the Central Methodist Church in Pontiac, and as an adult he served on the board for that congregation. He eventually drifted away from the church, though, because, as he put it, it got to the point where they were always after money. Church was drilled into Elwyn Brown, first as a Presbyterian and later in a non-denominational congregation. He and his wife loved singing church music together. That's one way that they met, and they would sometimes even perform on the radio. A church connection also helped Elwyn get access to the skilled trades. Someone fixed him up, got him an apprenticeship. Ernie Lyles had grown up in a Pentecostal church, the Church of God, but eventually joined a non-denominational congregation. He felt called to the ministry as an adult and left Autowork for several years to lead a congregation in Arkansas. James Franklin was raised Baptist, but he became uncomfortable with the denomination's racial divisions, and he joined the Church of Christ in 1960. Strong religious beliefs about the man being the head of the household influenced his decisions regarding where to work, especially during layoffs. Joe Woods was a devout Christian with some acknowledged lapses in behavior. The mourners bench at his childhood church in Alabama made a huge impression on him. As a step towards atonement, it was always possible to be saved. Edith Arnold enjoyed her Presbyterian congregation as a child, especially the generosity shown by the minister and his wife in letting her family have the church's Christmas tree when they couldn't afford it and it was no longer needed for holiday services. And for a while, Edith wanted to become a missionary after listening to the minister's wife talk about her trips in China. As an adult, Edith wanted to find a home and a community in a church, but she found most denominations aggravating. For example, one that she went to that criticized Catholics. She couldn't understand that animosity. The Catholic Church was the foundation of Bud Weber's childhood, but his wife had been raised Presbyterian, so he compromised and attended her church. Similarly, Tamagorgenitis grew up in a Greek Orthodox family, but after marrying, he attended his wife's Episcopal church. Don Hester was baptized Catholic, but he attended a Methodist church with his foster family in Bad Axe. And Dorothy Sackle had a strained relationship with the Catholic Church. She was divorced because her husband beat her and was not faithful. She raised her children as a single parent, and she looked for support from her new parish in a different part of Detroit. Instead, she felt pressured to make financial contributions that she couldn't afford. She felt judged for being divorced. And she was also made aware of the possibility of priests preying on boys. But she was grateful to learn later in life that a priest told her that she was eligible again for communion. It meant so much to her. Katie Newman grew up in a Polish family, presumably with Catholic roots, but she didn't mention anything about religion. Well, she did divorce her first husband in the late 1950s. Divorce had troubled Dorothy Sackle on religious grounds, but Katie, at least in retrospect, wasn't bothered at all. She said they got along better after they were divorced. No indication that religion played much of a role at all in Paul Ross's life, although the Elks Lodge provided community for him. L.J. Scott's family was divided by religion. His mother offered religious instruction, but his father didn't want anything to do with the church. But L.J. had really fond memories of the revival meetings every summer, but more so about the food and the music than about any kind of religious instruction. But he wore his Sunday best clothes for his to apply for a job at Pontiac Motor. You know, he had some sense of the significance of looking your best. Gene Johnson remembered his brother Calvin carrying him piggyback to Sunday school before Calvin's tragic death as a teenager. And Gene was the one who had the spiritual conversion as an adult when his son, who had Legg-Calvé-Perthes disease, was healed. But Gene's parents didn't attend church. He didn't get that from them. The kids went on their own. And it gnawed on Gene that he had another kid, this one a daughter, who almost died of viral meningitis. And when she recovered, he promised to give his life to God. But he had lapsed in that promise before the faith healing event in Arkansas. So anyways, I'll just finish by saying all I can conclude from that is that religion and the church were really important in the lives of these people in very conflicting ways. You know, different experiences, different different lessons learned, but to varying degrees, religion and churches provided ethical guidance, community, frustration, possibility for redemption. And I think that all played a much more prominent role in their lives than we've been led to believe, because they're humans and because they were living in a culture and they were not two-dimensional people who only cared about their union contracts and this sort of thing. There's no formula to predict what kind of religious upbringing would produce activism or acceptance, responding to injustice or accepting it. It's impossible to tell from whatever information I glean. But one thing that I thought was interesting is that both the Amshay family in northern Michigan, which was very religious, and the Gene Johnson's family in Missouri, which was not, made it a point to feed the homeless who came by on trains and wandered through villages looking for work during the Great Depression. So there was some kind of ethical compass that they all had embedded in them. So I've got things on hobbies and interests. I have things on race, on first jobs, all sorts of issues. But I'm going to stop there, and I think that gives you a flavor, at least, of some of the things that I've discovered about these lives. And I want to make sure there's time to answer any questions you might have. So that's the end of the formal presentation. Are there any questions? Sure, because they won't be picked up in the microphone. Good point, yeah. Sure. Yeah, the question is, how did I become interested in this topic? And it's a really good question. Historians get pigeonholed in terms of their research by their dissertations in graduate school, getting your PhD. And I had no expectation, desire to become a labor historian. But when I was at Duke University in graduate school in the 1980s, I got involved in an oral history class and had to have an oral history project I was from Michigan, didn't know anything about the Durham, North Carolina area, and my grad instructor, or my grad professor, told me about a strike that had occurred in this cotton mill town, Henderson, North Carolina, in the late 1950s, and I got involved in researching that. And when I get started, I don't stop, and it ended up being a dissertation and then a book, and so I became a labor historian. Does that make sense? Again, just because of the nature of that project. I ended up back in Michigan, got a job at Oakland University, had 2 young kids, and I was looking for another research project, but one that wouldn't involve long trips away from home, right? And so that I started to look at the auto industry and the literature on auto workers, and that's when I learned that, wow, there really isn't much there. I'm an oral historian. I do labor history. It seemed like a natural fit, but it turned out to be a difficult process, but really a rewarding one. Does that make sense? Yeah. I also like learning about people who don't otherwise make it into history books. That was one of the things that drove me to graduate school in the first place. No other questions? Are any of you related to auto workers from the 1950s? Or cool, you have a question. Some of you are, yeah. Did anything I say resonate, or did it seem like I'm off base? Or okay. Yeah. I've noticed, before Disruption in Detroit came out, I gave a number of talks and encountered sometimes people who were auto workers in the 50s and sometimes children of them. For the most part, they thought things rang true, to the point where one guy actually ran a bakery across from his family ran a bakery across from the Dodge main plant, and he said they always considered auto work to be part-time work because there were so many layoffs. But I've encountered other people who challenged the notion because they've always heard that it wasn't that way. So, okay, yeah. Yeah, that's what was striking about the newspaper research I did, because it seemed like they were always on layoff. And some people were only working half of the 50s, But again, what else were they doing? That's what this project is designed to uncover. Looks like you had a question in the front row here. Did you? Did you have a question? Yeah. I thought maybe you had a question.
No.
Oh, okay. All right.
I lived through what you talked about.
Yeah. So was I on target or off target? Did what I say make sense to you? Did it sound plausible?
It's the history I lived through.
Okay. All right. So you're not listening to it and saying, "Wow, that doesn't sound right at all." Okay. Okay. And you all had family members who were auto workers, so I'm not requiring you to give a speech, but I just didn't know if you had anything to add. Yeah, the point is the comment that these people went to the Ransom Olds Museum, right? Okay, is it in Lansing? I think it is. Yeah, and they saw kind of a loop of video of was it video or audio? Well, video, yeah, of interviews with Oldsmobile or maybe even Rio employees. Oldsmobile and GM, okay. And so that's a collection, that particular collection would be one I'm not as familiar with, but I know that Lisa Fine, the person I mentioned who did the research on deer hunters, deer hunting and auto workers, she did interview a lot of our Rio workers, mainly from the 30s and 40s. So it's good to know that there's this other project. I'm not familiar with it, so I should look into it. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. The comment is about relatives who came en masse from Arkansas to Flint, worked at Buick, and then went back to Arkansas after retirement. And I did talk to a lot of people who went back and forth between their home state, their home villages, and Detroit, Pontiac. I didn't talk to people who were in Flint, other than maybe one person, but same kind of story. But sometimes everyone had moved to Michigan, and there wasn't anyone to move back to visit. And so, that became ironic. And sometimes you go back to your home state to visit family, but all your family is back in Michigan. But one thing I discovered as well is that there would be big picnics and reunions for people from like 3 counties in Kentucky, or one town in Pennsylvania, or everyone from Arkansas. And Ernie Lyles, who was from Arkansas, said there'd be enough people that you could field a whole bunch of softball teams and play all afternoon just with people from Arkansas. So even before social media and Facebook, they could organize these sorts of things and be able to hang out with with people who understood where they came from, and people they felt they could relate to better. Any other questions?
Is there anything that when you ask all these people, like, that came up a lot more frequently than you thought it was, like any common thread that might surprise you?
Yeah, the question is whether or not there was a common thread that surprised me more than anything else. The truth is that the common thread that surprised me more than anything else is what I converted into that first book, which diverted me away from the oral history project. It was the instability and the insecurity. But beyond that, the common thread is kind of the multiple perspectives that I've gotten on these themes. So I would say they're thematic threads, but the details are different in each case, and it makes me realize just how impossible it is to make any generalizations about a group of people, even though the literature is filled with generalizations about groups of people. And we have to make generalizations in some way in order to communicate. But this kind of research spoils those kinds of generalizations because all you find are exceptions to the rule. And so, that I think is, I don't know if that qualifies as a common thread, but it's a consistent revelation that if you think you know what you're going to hear next, think again. Erase that from your mind. You never can be sure what you're going to find out. And it can be, again, kind of the essence of what really made someone who they were. It could be something just more contemporary, some event in their lives. I interviewed one man who talked about his wife, and I said, how's she doing? And he broke down in tears because she had just recently died, and I had no idea, and I didn't mean to cause him pain. And we stopped the interview for a while, and then he decided he wanted to continue. But people are very vulnerable in those situations, and we try not to do any harm. But sometimes we stumble upon those kinds of circumstances, and again, there's no reason why he needed to continue talking to me at that point, but it was really a continuation of that gift. You're welcome. Yeah. So, anyways, I appreciate your patience. I appreciate you not falling asleep, and now you can go home and be safe, and maybe I'll see you again someday here. Who knows? Okay.